This is my long-awaited rant on Dana White, UFC, and the entire MMA organization. I think the whole professional fight circuit sucks these days. Boxing has its problems. Kickboxing, in my opinion, is still awesome, but it never really has been that popular. It never really has been that popular. And while the Glory Kickboxing organization today is awesome, it's nowhere near exciting as the K1 organization of the 90s and the early 2000s was. K1 is still around, but it's a shell of his former. It's a shell of his former self. It's not even on pay-per-view anymore. It's on Mark Cuban's HD Nets, which I think that channel sucks. That channel sucks. But this is my rant on UFC. Before I start, I'm a huge fan of the old UFC when it was no rules from 1993 till 1998 and that's when McCain shut them down. They were forced to put gloves on the competitors, and get rid of the awesome tournament format I loved, and switch to stereotypical boxing and professional wrestling like cards. But it was still good from 1998 till 2009 or 10. Right around the time Brock Lesnar joined or became champion, that's when it went downhill because in my opinion there were no longer any good fights. There were no longer any good fights. None of the fights really lived up to the hype. Brock Lesnar, I supported him in UFC, but his UFC career was garbage. His UFC career was garbage. I only liked him in UFC because I respected Brock Lesnar. He was a sports entertainer, a professional wrestler who wanted to prove he could fight for real, and I liked him putting the annoying UFC fans who are always bashing professional wrestling and professional wrestling fans, putting them in their place, putting them in their, putting them in their place, and of course, with that. But other than getting more heavyweights other than restoring the heavyweight division, Brock Lesnar, people like Brock Lesnar and Kimbo Slice ruined UFC. As soon as they became, it became all about hype. I don't remember not one good fight from that era. When Brock Lesnar left, it got a little bit better. Then again, I really wasn't watching much. The only fight I watched was UFC on Fox, Rich Franklin versus Vanderlei Silva, which was awesome. This was an awesome show. And then I watched a heavyweight fight. I think between another heavyweight fight between Dos Santos and Cain Velasquez. I think that's what it was. I don't remember. In 2013, it's on my channel, but I don't remember already. I don't remember. That's how much I really don't care about today's UFC product. But you have but today's UFC is just garbage. Besides not caring for the product, the fights. First off, there's way too many shows. There's way too many shows and too many mediocre fighters. Back in the old days, in the no rules eras, you had awesome fighters like King Shamrock, um, King Shamrock, Oleg Taktarov, Marco Ruas, Marco Ruas, um, you had fighters like that, and several more, and awesome brawlers like Paul Valorant, who wasn't a good fighter but a much more exciting brawler than the fighters today, and Tank Abbott, who also wasn't a good fighter. Then later on when they switched to the rules, I hated this. This was watered down, but it was still good. It was still good. You had awesome fighters like Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort. I don't like Tito Ortiz anymore, but I did when I was younger. Frank Shamrock, and Boss Rutan, even in the lighter divisions, Matt Serra, Ruthless Robbie Lawler, who is still there. Um, Mr. International Shoney Carter, Pete Spratt, Weaves Edwards, Kyle Uno, Carlos Newton, Matt Hughes, so many awesome Eugene Jackson, Murillo Basame, something like that. You um Big Daddy Cool, Gary Goobridge, Maurice Smith, Toyoshi Koshaka, Pedro Hizo, Rico Rodriguez, Andre Arlovsky. You had so many Forrest Griffin, Stephen Bonner. You had so many awesome fighters. So many awesome fighters. The fighters today, all they do is wrestle. All they do is wrestle because they can't stand up and fight. Then when they do stand up and fight, some of the worst punches, some of the most god awful punches I've ever seen. And it's offensive. They have nerve to call that boxing. It's kickboxing and wrestling, and it's barely kickboxing. Barely kickboxing. You want real kickboxing? Watch old school K1 or Glory. Um, um, um. So yeah, too many shows, too many mediocre fighters, and then fights just not living up to the hype. Fights just not living up to the hype. I finally got to see Cain Velasquez versus Brock Lesnar. UFC had on their channel, they have their free fights, and these free fights are just garbage. Just garbage. Just garbage. Also, another thing, I initially applauded Dana for this. Getting rid of old guys like Tito Ortiz and Rampage, because in my opinion, Tito Ortiz, in my opinion, ducked Chuck Liddell. Didn't want to lose a third time to him. Didn't want to lose a third time to him. So he he um he waited to the last minute to talk about his injury, which forced a replacement, which was Chuck Liddell versus Rich Franklin, ruining one of the UFC main events. Didn't still think he could stay on as a coach despite not doing anything. So happy Dana released him. Then released him or let his contract. He chose not to renew his contract. Then you got Rampage, who first off I've always hated Rampage, but I really started hating him after that atrocious fight with Rashad Evans. And I was so happy when he decided to leave because in his last days he was putting on some highly boring fights, including that one with Machida where he just laid in parade all day. He, Rampage. Then he goes to Bellator, which I actually liked him going to TNA and Bellator. For some odd reason, he hates TNA and Bellator. Talk crap about them, and now he's back in the UFC. And Dana White actually signed this guy back. Which proves he's desperate to up the UFC buys. Which is another problem I have with the UFC. You have really, despite having popular fighters like Marco Rua, John Jones, George St. Pierre, Cain Velasquez, none of these guys are stars. None of these guys draw much of anything. Which means you have to do things like sign CM Punk, which I'm mixed about. Half of me is excited about it because CM Punk, I found him boring in his last few days of WWE, and now UFC gives some interest to the UFC product, but at the same time, it's a slap in the face to all the UFC fighters who, on the small MMA circuit, underground MMA circuit, busting their butts to get to the UFC, and not there, but you have this professional WWE wrestler in the UFC, which just makes your organization looks uncredible and a joke. So mixed about that. And it shows to how desperate he is for the mainstream, which is one of the things I liked about the UFC. I like the UFC because they were more popular than WWE, but I could criticize WWE, but UFC right now is even worse than that, and it's the same crap in WWE. Well, but this was me talking about the UFC. This was me talking about the UFC product. Let me talk about other things I don't like about the UFC. Of course, I also love the Japanese organizations. First off, the professional wrestling organizations, UWFI International, its successor Kingdom Pro, and of course the first real professional wrestling promotion, which was Pancras, Pancras. We are hybrid wrestlers, and of course the most popular MMA organization of all time, the Pride Fighting Championships. The Pride Fighting Championships. These promotions had awesome fighters, highly exciting fights, and had awesome tournament competition. The Pride Fighting Championships was one of the largest and most prestigious and most premier fighting leagues of all. Some of the best fighters in the world competed in that arena, in that in that arena, But they had problems with the Yakuza, and that led to the end of Pride. That led to the end of Pride. Then here's what I'm getting at. Pride FC, along with having Pride FC, Pride FC pretty much took fighters from all over the world, and allowed them to come and ply their trade under that one roof to see who the best was. They had Grand Prix to determine who the best was, and stuff. And here's UFC monopolizing the MMA game and running it like a professional wrestling organization. So any top fighter outside the UFC has to sign with the UFC, to get a fight, which, in my opinion, that makes your organization incredible. Then the UFC likes to walk around like they have the best fighters in the world. They're the greatest martial artists in the world. They're not even martial artists. They're just mediocre wrestlers and brawlers, and not even good ones, not even good exciting ones at that. Now you have some good martial artists like Machida and GSP, but they have to train those styles away to be a match for be a match for them. Then you got fighters like GSP who no fighter can match him. Once again, mediocre fighters. That was the same with Silva for a while. Anderson Silva, another great fighter. So I hate that he monopolized the organization. A fighter has to sign with the UFC to come in that organization. Then of course we can't see crossovers from other sports like boxing and stuff, boxing and kickboxing and stuff, because they would have to sign a contract with the UFC, and of course the UFC fighters would never compete in their sports. So that's how it is. And then of course the worst. So yeah, I hate how the UFC fighters have to stay exclusive to the UFC. They can't work as independent contractors, which means we don't get to see a lot of fights. We just get to see the same fighters all the time, and they're mediocre fighters at that. The next problem I have with the next problem is another big one. In Pride, one of the coolest things I love about Pride in the early UFC, besides the tournament competition, was the outfits. You could wear what you want. It was freestyle. You could wear what you want to the outfits. Now everyone has to wear short tights or trunks, which is cool. But does everyone have to dress like that? No jogging or track pants. No speedo underwear style, which they can't wear anymore. No singlets. All three types of singlets. No singlets. No professional wrestling tights. No jeans, no cool karate martial art gis, nothing. Everyone has to wear the exact same thing, which makes all the fighters look the same. It is boring. Which brings my next point, I already said this, every fighter fights the same. And then they don't even try to fight. They pace themselves. They don't come out swinging. They aren't trying to finish the fight. They pace themselves and wrestle and lay on the ground all day. And then crappy rules. One rule, okay, I can understand no eye gouging and low blows, striking the groin like in the old UFC. I can understand it, as even though that takes away the concept of no holds barred fighting. That's not technique. And so I'm cool with that. But one cool thing about Pride was when the fighters lay on the ground, the UFC fighter, the fighters could kick them like soccer kicks, or jump on top of them, or jump on top of them, jump on top of them, jump on top of them, which I thought was really cool, which I thought was really cool. The fighters, they can't do that anymore. They can't do that anymore. They can't do that anymore, which makes, well, they just lay there all day and it's just what's his name? The next problem I have, and the final problem I have with the UFC, is since Dana White got big with what, since Dana White has the biggest promotion in town and got big with what he's doing, smaller promotions like the International Sports Combat Federation, King of the Cage, Gladiator Challenge, and of course, um, of course, their rival Bellator MMA. They have to look like the UFC. Even that Pancrase, we are hybrid wrestlers, which in the early '90s had open palm strikes, open palm strikes, kick pads, and mat shoes, open palm strikes with body shots, wrestling and kickboxing, which I thought was way cooler than the bare knuckle MMA style, which they would later do, with Pride. No, they now look like the UFC. I do think they still have the tournaments, the King of Pancrase. But what's his name? I like the shoot wrestling, the shoot fighting, and the shoot wrestling more, which was what MMA was. MMA is pretty much the real version of professional wrestling. I will never glorify that as martial arts. They have real martial artists in there, but I will never glorify that as martial arts. You want martial arts? Go to the knockdown karate tournaments. Go to the kickboxing competitions, the Wing Chun competitions. Um, yeah, that right there. Taekwondo, all that. That's martial arts. I will never glorify MMA as martial arts. Martial arts. Um, these have been my problems with the UFC. I supported the UFC for as long as I did because because like I said, they were doing better than WWE, and UFC is mainstream. They have what I want WWE and TNA to have, like it was when I was like professional. I want professional wrestling as a whole to have that when I was younger. But UFC sucks, and it's way worse than the WWE. It's way worse than WWE. Yeah, the fights are real, but they're boring and disappointing, and the fighters are mediocre. Um, and that's one reason you don't even see me reviewing much of UFC. It's just so boring. Sometimes I don't even tune into the streams, and when you tune into the streams, it's just the preliminaries bore me so much I don't even make it to the main events, man. Or when I'm watching on TV, the UFC on Fox shows or on FX, they're boring, dull, uninteresting. All right, this was my rant on MMA. All right, Doug out.